Songfell, Chapter 4, The King. It started as soon as they left the room. The guard said his usual,
"Go and return safely, Your Eminence,"
in his usual, half-respectful, mostly bored tone, glanced over at the sound of bones clicking on the marble floor, and nearly shrieked as Sans closed the door behind him.
"Sup?"
said the boss monster. The man clutched his weapon and inched far, far back, eking out a miniature version of
"Hail, visitor,"
from behind the halberd shaft. Sans gave him a big smile, looming over the poor man with his fangs on full display. Frisk raised her hand very slightly.
"That will do, Sans,"
she said in her high priestess voice.
"You, sir. When I returned from services last night, I found my chambers unguarded. When you have finished your work today, inform your sergeant that I will speak with him this evening and learn the reason for this malfeasance. Until then, no one is to enter for any reason. Is that clear?"
Nod, nod, nod. Frisk folded her hands and walked as briskly away as her tight gown would allow, clearing her throat to stop Sans from waving bye-bye in the guard's face. They were at the stairwell before she permitted herself to smile under the veil.
"This is gonna be a long day,"
the skeleton said as they hurried down multiple flights of stairs.
"You have to do this every time you go somewhere?"
"Correct. I dare you to try it in these shoes, too."
Frisk picked up her skirt enough to reveal her high-heeled slippers.
"Hell no. I'm not paying for those in my size,"
he retorted. But as he came down the wide staircase a few steps below her, his eye sockets seemed to stay pointed at her feet for several seconds, long enough to make her wonder if she was imagining it, and remind her of the times she had caught him staring at her during their lessons. Actually, it was hard not to wonder about several things. Sans definitely seemed penitent, and he had ignored several opportunities to escape after his initial attempt failed. That in itself was noteworthy, but then there were all those odd, multicolored looks, how he'd healed her after she'd been stupid enough to break her hand hitting him, telling Papyrus that she was okay, a standing ovation by his standards, protecting her, touching her face, that jokey,
"I think I love you."
Frisk shook herself. She was being pathetic. Just because she'd gone straight from a convent to an exalted position with no opportunity in between for any romantic endeavors, that was no excuse to latch on to the first male of either species she happened to spend time with. Was she really this starved for affection? Was she genuinely trying to convince herself that a misanthropic skeleton, behaving with a shred of decency, meant he'd somehow fallen madly in love with her in less than a week? What would she even do if he had? Which he hadn't.
"He'll be gone soon,"
she reminded herself.
"Think of what you need to do. Be grateful he doesn't want you dead and he's agreed to protect you."
Besides, there was always the basket of letters in her workroom. Frisk wrinkled her nose, but had to smooth it out as they approached the chapel doors. She never knew who was looking closely enough to see under her veil. For most morning services, a minor priestess was in charge of the readings, while Frisk directed the choir and gave the closing benediction. This particular morning, she walked into the chapel with Sans 3 steps behind, bracing herself, and hoping the parishioners would be too shocked to do anything but sit and stare. The organist was warming up as they headed to the altar, and a ripple of gasps and terrified whispers began running up and down the pews, almost in time with the music. When Frisk stationed the skeleton in a partly hidden nook and assumed her position facing the congregation, she came within milliseconds of laughing again. Every face was frozen in pop-eyed disbelief, most of their mouths agape. She made the mistake of glancing at Sans, who opened his own mouth and did an impression of the shocked humans that nearly broke her. There was nothing for it. Reminding herself that Sans was quite frightening to look at, Frisk disregarded protocol again and motioned for the priestess at the altar to move aside. The girl was happy to do so, putting Frisk between herself and Sans. The High Priestess waited until everyone began to notice that nothing was happening, calming down enough to get curious. Then,
I beg your attention, ladies and gentlemen. We are joined today by an emissary from the Monster Kingdom, who has agreed to apprentice under me as we strive to renew peaceful relations between our nations. I beg you to put aside fear and hatred, and join me in welcoming Sans as an honored guest of Church and Crown.
she turned to the minor priestess.
My apologies, Sister Olivia. Please begin.
To her profound relief, the majority of her listeners seemed thoughtful or intrigued, a few nodding slowly. Only 4 or 5 of them got up and left, which was better than she'd hoped. To her even greater relief, Sans stayed quite still and well-behaved for the whole service. The chapel was lavishly decorated with stained glass, statuary, and an embroidered altar cloth, but as Frisk remembered all too well from childhood, it wasn't enough to look at for an entire hour. She was probably the only one who could tell how bored Sans was as the prayers wore on. She learned quickly not to look at him during the readings, because he kept making faces and forcing her to bite the insides of her cheeks. Thank God she wasn't scheduled to sing today. The service eventually ended, and she glanced apologetically at the boss monster as people rushed up to the altar, forming a dense, fretful clot around her. The first question to make it through the hubbub was,
Is this the skeleton you bested in the dungeons, my lady?
Frisk had already fielded many inquiries about that incident, and had kept her answers vague. Now, knowing whatever she said would be disseminated by people who had witnessed Sans' size and non-ferocity for themselves, she could tell them,
Yes, the monsters have been suffering a famine for many years, and Sans was captured in search of food for his family. By the time I came down to speak with him, he had been imprisoned for several days, without knowing what his fate would be. Monsters are not animals, and he understood very well that he would likely be killed or enslaved. He had every reason to believe I was a threat and behave accordingly. Since we reached an understanding, he has given me no reason to worry for my or anyone else's safety.
She let them absorb that information, and it seemed to be working, though the next questions were still,
Is it dangerous?
and
How do we know it won't turn on you?
luckily, the priestess had had plenty of practice at not screaming
Were you even listening?
at people, and stayed as calm, patient, and reassuring as possible, emphasizing that the skeleton was not dangerous and was not her slave, or an it, adding that he would remain with her for another 6 weeks. That last was a deliberate lie. No one was going to take custody of Sans from her through official channels, but anyone who wanted to get a hold of him illicitly would probably make their move closer to the middle or end of his visit, after they'd gotten more information to work with. If they thought he'd be there longer than was the case, it could very well keep him safer. She wasn't sure if Sans could hear them from where he was, but she suspected he could, because the 5th time someone asked,
Are you sure it isn't going to hurt us?
the skeleton uncrossed his arms and lumbered up to the altar, scattering humans before him like frightened birds.
Please excuse us, everyone, and peace be with you. Thank you for your patience, Sans.
Frisk told him.
Would you like to take a different route back?
Indubitably.
Sans said, confusing everyone in earshot.
After you, milady.
He nodded in the human's general direction before setting off after Frisk, who had folded her hands again to conceal their shaking. Her heart rate slowed somewhat as they crossed several hallways to the foyer connecting the chapel with most other wings of the palace. Double-paned, diamond-patterned windows reached from a few feet off the floor to the 5-story ceiling, and crystal chandeliers caught the sunlight and scattered it like tiny opals across the blue carpet. The marble floors and columns had been polished to near mirror brightness. A guard was stationed at every door, with 2 at the foot of each staircase. The men did double takes as they passed, but were better trained than those assigned to Frisk's room. They recovered quickly, bowing to the High Priestess and taking their cue to ignore the giant skeleton trailing after her. Each guard was lean and alert, with a sword in hand and a dagger at the hip.
I thought you were gonna sing today.
Sans said suddenly. Frisk didn't understand where that came from till she saw him checking out the weaponry and remembered the assassin's remark about her voice and her body. Her hands tightened involuntarily.
I rarely do at Matins. More people attend Vespers, so we use the morning services as practice for the less experienced clergy. I'm essentially there to supervise.
She stopped in front of a set of double doors, so tall that Sans could walk through without ducking his head. This time, a footman scurried to open them for her, leaving the guards free to try not to stare at the boss monster.
I'm excused this evening because I was supposed to be there last night. Enough people saw me before the service that I can pretend I was there the whole time.
Sans stepped up beside her, trying not to walk too fast.
Atta girl. That shit is boring.
The High Priestess bit her cheek again.
That is no way to speak of a holy ritual.
She scolded him.
Well, I'd rather get a holy in my head than have to do that every day.
She emitted a low that made him laugh in turn, and they might have started another cycle if someone in red and white livery hadn't spotted them from far up the hall and began jogging over.
Your Eminence!
The man called. Sans moved half in front of her, but Frisk tapped his elbow and murmured,
It's all right. He's the king's manservant. Yes, Lucas?
His Majesty and His Holiness jointly request the honor of your presence at your earliest convenience,
said the manservant, sparing Sans a bored glance. Frisk knew a command when she heard one.
Of course.
She beckoned for Sans to follow as the man turned to speed walk back the way he'd come.
Have you heard, my lady?
Lucas said as they hurried along.
That a man was found dead in the Hyacinth courtyard early this morning.
Oh dear.
The priestess responded, careful not to overdo it.
Was he murdered?
Behind her, the boss monster made a very quiet noise, and she turned her head just enough to shut him up. It was almost a shame to waste her acting on one person. She doubtless would have had this conversation with her parishioners if Sans hadn't taken precedence.
No, it seemed he jumped from a great height.
Said the manservant.
A very great one.
Frisk shook her head with a little sigh.
Oh, what a hideous tragedy. Peace be upon his soul, and those of his loved ones.
Sans was loudly silent as the servant made several rapid turns and steered them up a series of increasingly opulent staircases, through wider and more richly carpeted halls. Eventually, they reached a set of doors over 20 feet high, emblazoned with the kingdom's heraldic griffins in brass and precious stones.
Fancy,
remarked Sans.
Very kind of you, sir.
Lucas stood to attention as the footman hastened to open the door, the guards calling up and down the room that Her Eminence had arrived.